My name is Diane Buglioli, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of a very special place, which provides services to people with developmental disabilities. But that's not the capacity in which I'm here today. I am also the co-chair of the Willowbrook Property Planning Committee of the Staten Island Developmental Disabilities Council. That council is the main advocacy group for people with developmental disabilities since the 1960s. And our concern and our focus on the Willowbrook property is because of that history of Willowbrook here on Staten Island. This series, which is called Willowbrook Revisited, is just that. It's revisiting the history of that property and everything that happened on that property. Not only the occupants, the people who lived there, but the people who controlled it, and the society that surrounded it, in which it existed all these years. Today's panel that is with us is here to talk about the transformation that occurred on that property since the 1600s. And we have a wonderful panel here today that all bring their own perspective to this topic. But let me give this audience just the sense of Willowbrook in terms of that it was the focus of an expose that was done in the 1970s by Geraldo Rivera, which focused on the conditions at Willowbrook State School. So when we talk about Willowbrook in this series, we're talking about not the mall in New Jersey. We're not talking about the property that's known as Willowbrook, that general neighborhood on Staten Island, but we're talking about Willowbrook State School. And the transformation that happened, as well as what was happening on the property itself, but also the mindset and what people felt about what was happening on the property. That's what we're revisiting, so that all of the people that are watching the show who may have a connection to the property, they fully understand it, but they really don't understand all of the different facets that occurred. And for those people in the audience who really don't know what Willowbrook is, we want to really inform you and give you the information, because we really see that site as a very special place, because it really was the ground zero of the human rights progress for people with disabilities. So let's introduce the people that are here today. Start with David.
Sure. I'm David Goode. I'm a professor of sociology at the City University of New York, College of Staten Island. And I've been involved with the study of Willowbrook since I got here about 25 years ago. I had worked in an institution in California before I got here and developed an interest there. And then when I was hired at the College of Staten Island and learned that we were going to Willowbrook, it was just a natural thing for me to become very involved. My students will recognize me as wandering around the campus for 25 years, picking things up, looking at them, collecting information. We've had an annual Willowbrook lecture basically since I've got here, and over the years I've learned an awful lot about Willowbrook and the site and the people who are here. That culminated in a book that was published in 2013 with a fellow faculty member who you'll meet later on in this series, and I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. James.
Well, I'm James Kaiser, and I'm a professor and archivist at the College of Staten Island. And one of the focuses of our archival collection is the Willowbrook State School. And so for about the last 10 years, we've been assembling material about the Willowbrook site, and then that's why I'm here today.
Okay, great. Hal.
Hi. First, Diane, thank you very much for arranging this, and with the council, we very much appreciate your involvement and the council's involvement in seeing to it that the history of the Willowbrook property be properly preserved and properly understood, which I think is the most important thing and will be the most important outcome of this whole series. So again, thank you very much, Diane. My name is Hal Kennedy, and I'm an attorney, but more importantly for the purposes of this series, I'm a parent of a young lady with a developmental disability. My involvement with Willowbrook goes back to a period of when my daughter attended her nursery school run by UCP at Willowbrook. For a short period of time, she was there at the school anyway for about a year. This was after Willowbrook had been transformed and private voluntary agencies were using the space at Willowbrook. And I was very interested in it. there is a wonderful history to the property going back to colonial times, which we'll hear from James, and also through World War II, Halloran Hospital, which I'm going to speak a little bit about today. So that's the reason why I'm here, and thank you very much.
Okay. And for those people that aren't as aware, when we talk about Willowbrook State School and when we talk about the property, we're actually talking about the property that is bounded by Forest Hill Road, Victory Boulevard, I guess Willowbrook Park, and Rockland Avenue. That's that 365 acres of property that now comprises the College of Staten Island, the Elizabeth Connolly Resource Center, and the Institute for Basic Research. Those three institutions are on those three facilities are on that property that once was Willowbrook State School. But before then, James, we don't have any cave dwellings that we know of in drawings, so we'll just go back to colonial times.
Right. Well, I got interested in how the property was used over time, and really, if anyone who's familiar with the campus today knows it's very marshy, and of course it's named Willowbrook, so, and there is in fact a stream that runs through it. And if you think about early settlement and the needs of earliest settlers, today, of course, we think, well, those are disadvantages, marshy, wet ground. But for early settlers, this would have been perhaps a good place to settle, because people would have been traveling by dugout canoe. They would be able to navigate those small streams. And they would be looking for, if they had cows, they'd be looking for an easy source of fodder, so they would be able to harvest the grasses that grew in the marsh. And of course, there would be shellfish and fish. So, you know, this wasn't a bad place to settle. And it wasn't very far from the shore, actually, so that you'd be able to get out so you'd be able to navigate around the island as well. But the first land records that I found documented land holding in the 1680s, and the man who owned a lot of property there was named John Palmer, and John Palmer was his primary residence was in Manhattan. He was a lawyer. He was also a judge for the court of Oyer and Terminer. And on Staten Island, he was a ranger, which means, I think, that he was responsible for commanding a unit that patrolled around the fortified areas. He was responsible for that. Whether he was directly involved or not, I'm not so clear. Mm-hmm. But the other interesting thing about John Palmer is that some of the land that he only held for a brief amount of time. And so I got interested in why that was the case. And I saw that the property was actually purchased by Governor Dongan, the royal colonial governor. And what seems to have happened is that Dongan wanted to be a lord. And in order to be a lord, you had to have a manor, and it had to comprise a certain number of acres. And so Dongan seems to have transferred land to Palmer, because there had been scandals in the past about these colonial governors they would come, they would essentially grab all this land, and then benefit dramatically from it. So in order to prevent any charges of wrongdoing, Dongan had the land, but he gives it to Palmer so that he can buy it back. So there's an official record that he bought the land. And through this transaction and other similar transactions on Staten Island, he accumulates 25,000 acres.
Hence Dongan Hills. Right? Yeah, I'm sitting here waiting to say that. It's Dongan Hills. As a kid who grew up in Berry Homes, that's Dongan Hills. Yeah.
Well, so this is enough land that he is then named a lord. It's called the Manor of Castleton, and he is the lord. And
Castleton Corners.
Castleton Corners, which is near our campus.
Right.
So, those early days of the colonial history turned out to be fairly interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
And also,
yeah.
when we talked about it briefly at one time, James, there was also a Tory, there was like a pub in the area, a tavern in the area.
Yeah, so what happens is the next interesting kind of thing I found was that the Dongan family retained control of a lot of the land, but they don't seem to have done much with it. But they did construct a stone dwelling in the 1750s. And then they later sell that and some land, and that structure came to be known as the Christopher House because the family who owned it obviously was Christopher,
yeah.
and it was, I believe, Joseph Christopher who was the first principal person to live there. He was interesting because prior to the Revolution and during the Revolution, he was at the head of the a committee of safety for Staten Island. And the Tory part of it is, so Staten Island during the war is the base for the British troops, and Christopher secretly is still meeting to oppose the British. But not very far from where his house was located was a tavern, Bull's Head Tavern, and that's where the Tories met.
Yeah.
And
That's
Bull's Head
interesting.
Tavern was near the intersection of Victory Boulevard and Richmond Road.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so during the Revolution, there's some interesting things happening in the Willowbrook vicinity
Then, of
as
course,
well.
you had the major thoroughfare going, which is now Victory Boulevard, but at the time was the Richmond Turnpike.
Right.
Right,
Richmond
that
Turnpike.
Well, that's interesting, and that's one of the things we were talking about. You know, why this area would have been a good place to settle, but I forgot about one important aspect of transportation, which was there were two major trails on Staten Island that crossed near where the campus is today, and one was called the Blazed Trail, and I sort of forget what the other one was called, but I think it was called the Willowbrook Trail.
I think it was
actually.
called the Willowbrook
Yeah.
Trail. I was going to
Willowbrook
say
Trail.
that's what's on the monument, right?
Right. So there was a monument recognizing the location of where those trails crossed, because these would have been important transportation thoroughfares for people at the time. They weren't roads; they were literally more like trails. But the Blaze Trail ended at a ferry that where you could get transportation across the water to what is now New Jersey. So even in the colonial period, there were these trails that ran through it. But then in the early 19th century, we get Richmond Turnpike, and Richmond Turnpike comes about because a New York State governor, Daniel Tompkins, got very interested in Staten Island during his time in office, because he was governor of New York State from 1807 to 1817, and during the War of 1812, he realized, of course, the strategic importance of Staten Island and was responsible for fortifications being built there. But he also saw it as a link, a transportation link between Manhattan and New Jersey. Of course, this will sound very familiar to all Staten Islanders. And thus he after the War of 1812, he starts a ferry initially in what is now Tompkinsville, and then he forms a company that builds Richmond Turnpike, most of which ran the route of what is now Victory Boulevard. And that ended, then it terminated at a ferry. So people could come over from Manhattan by ferry, get on a stagecoach that went across Richmond Turnpike, and then Richmond Turnpike ends at the new Blazing Star Ferry, which was something that the Turnpike Company then could manage and own, and take that ferry across to New Jersey and then be on their way to Philadelphia.
So
And it ran right adjacent to
this
the site we're
property.
talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
So that property itself, though, so during colonial times, there's some farms that are around that area, right? And then at some point, it turns over to a park type of setting, right?
Well, really, what happens in the 19th century is that there's some small industry that comes along.
Okay.
There's some small industry. There's because there is a stream, so there's the possibility of water power, and so there are things like a sawmill and a grist mill, which would have been very common at the time. But a more unusual kind of facility was a gun factory.
Yeah, I saw that
There was
on
a
the map. Right.
there's a gun factory that was located there, and then in the mid-19th century, an English immigrant started a factory that manufactured steel combs for the
correct.
textile industry.
Correct.
His name was Thomas Standring, and surprisingly, that facility remained active up into the early 20th century.
Okay.
Initially they were making steel combs for the textile industry, but then later they're making combs to curry animals that are also out of
right.
metal. You know, those
Okay,
the
yeah,
currying
yeah, yeah.
combs.
A curry brush is made of metal, yeah.
So by the time he Standring died in the 1890s, and then his son took it over, and it continued to make these combs right up into the early 20th century. So there was some small industry as well as the farming that was happening.
But when does that 365-acre piece, does it change into parkland at one point? Because I want to get from the parkland to Halloran
Right,
Hospital,
yeah.
so that
Right.
transition occurs.
And what happens is an important part of the transitional period is that you have essentially what we would think of today as truck farms starting. They're little specialty farms. And German and Italian immigrants in the late 19th century are mostly the people who have these farms in that area. And starting in the early 20s, a real estate company starts buying up mortgages on all these farms and assembling a property. And then there's an announcement that New York City is going to be buying parkland. They're going to be buying land for a park on Staten Island. And the real estate company says, oh, well, we have this. We have hundreds of
It's just
acres
serendipity,
here.
I guess. Eh?
Who knew that you would be
Who knew?
wanting to buy land for a park? We've already assembled the parcel. And the interesting thing is that in the coverage for the hearings associated with the purchase of the land, initially the land is going to be purchased for, in the initial announcement, they're going to purchase the land for something like $1,500 an acre or something like that. But after this, after they're approached by this real estate company, by the end of the negotiations, they purchased the land for $6,000 an acre.
Oh my goodness.
And which was a significant amount
yes.
of money at the
Really?
time. And the odd thing is that in earlier newspaper articles there had been this discussion about, oh, how clever the city is because they're buying land on Staten Island before these bridges that are going to be completed, and therefore the land values will be low, and yet they end up paying $6,000 an acre for the land.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. Did you do any research into the relationship between the owner of this property and perhaps the government itself? I mean, was there any untoward relationships?
I haven't been able to investigate that personally, but the names, the real estate company and the one of the principals in the real estate firm was of the same family that the wife of the then New York State governor, as the wife of the then New York State governor. So there does seem to have been some connection there. Maybe a coincidence.
That's a
It
mere
might be a
coincidence.
And
so
that park was known as an extremely beautiful park. It was considered to be one of the most beautiful places on Staten Island.
So that was in 1928. So that's
Right.
what
So
brings us
we're in
up to
20s, and so what's happening then And in terms of how the Department of Mental Hygiene got onto this property,
yeah.
David, is that this is during the period of the 20s, 30s, is institutionalization
Yes,
is
yes.
becoming the mode of treatment,
Correct.
or the mode of how to address the needs of people,
Correct.
right?
There's a wonderful book that I'll refer you to, called From Snake Pits to Cash Cows by Paul Castellani. And he talks about the history of the institutions in New York State. And you really do have to understand that history a little bit to understand how Willowbrook got placed at the site that it is. And just very briefly, because we really want to stay on the site, when there used to be a kind of large Willowbrook on Randall's Island, and that was operated by the city and the state. And the city decided it didn't want to pay any more money for those people. And so what happened is that they were all transferred to state facilities upstate. Wassaic in particular. And that created a big vacuum down here in New York. Many people had children that were just too far to visit. And there was a lot of discussion in the 30s, even in the early 30s, about well, they'll build a facility down here. And there's a lot of politics about where that facility ended up getting built. There were a lot of different sites that they considered, not only on Staten Island, but in Bronx and Queens, and several sites here on Staten Island. But in the end, for reasons that are not entirely rational, they decided to place the institution at the Willowbrook site. And I say not entirely rational because we've already discussed the inappropriateness of that particular site to house an institution. It violates, interestingly, the earliest discussions of institutions when they were built in the 19th century. One of the primary factors was drainage and keeping the water, flowing and so forth. So right from the very beginning, they picked one of the worst sites they possibly could have. Mm-hmm. And the way that gets to Halloran is at the end of the 1930s, they completed the facility in the early 40s. They give the money in the end of the 1930s. And then as they're about to consider opening it up,
World War II.
World War II comes up, and then there must have been even earlier discussions before they took it over, and they decided that the Army, would take precedence over the people's families, and so that's how we get to Army owning well, not owning, but
Well, they didn't own it.
Yeah,
What happened is that in 1938, the Willowbrook construction was started, and it was completed by 1942. And of course, World War II was in the throes in 1940, and then there was Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. By September of 1942, the Army was looking for some sort of large-scale medical facility. And because Willowbrook had already been built, or most of the buildings completed, it was decided that the Army would lease the grounds at Willowbrook and all of the buildings for the duration of the war. What's interesting is that lease was signed in September, late September of 1942. The first patients went into Halloran Hospital in November of 1942. So talking about an accelerated schedule, and although there was new buildings, there was certain modifications that had to be made to the buildings, because after all, this was a buildings that were created for younger folks. So the wards and what have you, bathroom facilities, sinks, toilets, and what have you, had to be changed to accommodate soldiers. But just to talk a little bit about what Halloran Hospital was about, again, the Army was looking for a hospital to receive. It started out as what they called a receiving hospital, and it was changed its name to a general hospital. But what's fascinating about Halloran is during the course of the war, there were about 160,000 soldiers made their way through Halloran for treatment. But the philosophy at Halloran was as a soldier came in and left within about 72 hours. And the idea behind it was that the soldier would be either operated on or given some sort of treatment at Halloran, and then the soldier would be returned to a place nearest his home or her home. The thought being, of course, that it would be better to convalesce near home, and it also was able to spread all of the soldiers who were injured throughout the United States, and that in fact was done. The New York Times called Halloran Hospital a medical city, and rightfully so, because when you start to look at the literature and you look at the pictures, this was some amazing place. And it was at the cutting edge at the time of different practices, especially in orthopedics, in drug therapy, infectious diseases. Penicillin, for instance, was first tried out at Halloran Hospital in a large-scale method. The ophthalmology was also a big concern. In fact, they were able to develop prostheses for the glass eyes at Halloran Hospital. So it was big. It was tremendous. The hospital could receive up to 2,500 soldiers a day. Of course, what did that mean for Staten Island? Well, when you think about it, you had to transport 2,500 soldiers a day, at a max anyway, and then also return 2,500 soldiers. When you think about it, what came in went back out again. So there was a wonderful network of transportation. Soldiers came to Halloran either through Floyd Bennett. They were flown in Brooklyn and then transported. They were transported on ships. They were de-embarked in Tompkinsville. There was also the greatest numbers, I think, came in probably through the train system, which came into Staten Island by Holland Hook, and then they were transported in ambulances from Holland Hook to Halloran. There was a vast network of local citizens who volunteered, for instance, to drive these ambulances and what have you. So it was an amazing place. It was also a place for POWs. There were about 650 Italian and German POWs that were at Halloran. And what's somewhat interesting about that story and the POWs is that the POWs got along very well, at least the Italians did at Halloran Hospital. And in fact, the Italians were so trusted as POWs that they were given day passes and could roam around to Staten Island and go to different places, which they did, and they attended social events and dances and what have you. The Germans, I don't think, were as welcomed on Staten Island, but certainly the Italians were. There is one instance of a German escaping from the POW barracks, and he lasted about one day. He said he just wanted to go out and see what America was all about, and then he escaped back into Halloran because he told his captors, he said, the food is much better in here than outside. So, but you know, Halloran really operated as this huge city. The guy who ran Halloran was a fellow by the name of Ralph DeVoe. He was a colonel. At least he started out as a colonel when Halloran was opened, and by the 1944 he had been promoted to general. But this was an amazing man. He was a medical doctor, but more importantly, he was a superb administrator. And his belief was that we had to fix our soldiers, and we had to do it quickly, and we had to do it correctly. But we also had to worry about morale. And morale not only for the fellow who was being fixed, but also for the doctors and nurses and all of the people who supported that patient at Halloran. So he went to great lengths to make sure that everything was right at Halloran. They had good eating facilities, they had good chapels, they had good recreational facilities. He built or had built a 9-hole golf course designed by this guy, Trent Jones, who was a famous golfer. He raised $20,000 from the local citizenry to pay for that, and he had the POWs build the 9-hole golf course. They had musical, one of the first instances where people were seeing TV broadcasts was at Halloran Hospital. NBC donated TVs. There were sporting events that were televised from Madison Square Garden for the soldiers. So a guy, this General DeVoe, really worked very, very hard to make sure that everyone was treated appropriately and fairly. And on that point, it's interesting too, at the time the services were not integrated, were not racially integrated. And yet Halloran Hospital, the races were not segregated in any way, shape, or form. And I think DeVoe probably, although I don't know this for a fact, but went through great lengths to make sure that people knew that. So the publicity photos that went out, they would often see a black soldier next to a white soldier, or how the soldiers were transported. Again, you would see black or white. Or at social events, it was black and white. So he was making great strides in making sure that people understood that race was not a issue, and it may have been an issue, but he was working at least against it.
Thank you all for being with us today, and I hope people have a new understanding of some of the information we discussed now, and that you'll join us for our next segment, which will be about Halloran Hospital. And the one after that will be the Willowbrook story in terms of its sociology and its history. So thank you very much.